Hi BookTube. Today I would like to revisit a video that I did last year called Why I Love Russian Literature. I spent most of 2017 reading as much Russian literature as I possibly could, and I have a huge pile of books that I'll quickly go through and how they made me love Russian literature even more. And the reasons that I like it is more expansive than it was in that video. Just a quick recap, that video, I basically said that I like Russian literature because it can be a form of activism to write a book, and social commentary, and just having that discussion about society and how you can make it better and that kind of stuff. And also the word that I should have used in that video is called intertextuality, is when a book is inspired by a previous generation's book or other books, and there's that conversation that happens between books and I guess amongst authors. So yeah, so I'll just get started with a huge pile of Russian books. I've accumulated a few of them over the years, and just last year too I bought a few. But just a quick disclaimer, my pronunciation of Russian names and Russian words has not actually improved. I know Cyrillic now for writing it down, but my pronunciation is still not very good. There's a lot of sounds in the Russian language that we just don't have in English. So I think it'll take a lot more practice to improve my Russian pronunciation. And it would help if in real life, if I know actual real Russian people and have that dialogue and be able to practice my pronunciation with a living human being. It helps a lot for learning a language that way, as opposed to just simply through YouTube and stuff. So also I heard that the Russian language is incredibly fluid for its grammar, and the actual sentence structure is very fluid and flexible, and once you learn all the grammar rules, you can be very creative with the language in ways that you can't do with English, because the English word order is pretty much set for how you're going to say something, whereas in Russian, something about it is very more creative and fluid, which is pretty interesting. So that's where I got into maybe learning about different translators for Russian literature, and I'm really curious how different authors, if their writing style in the original Russian language is different, what are some of the challenges that the English translator would have when they're translating the work into English? Are different authors, do they give different challenges to the translator? That's something that I'm really interested in, that's a new idea for me that I didn't have last year. And that idea really sparked when I read that biography about Constance Garnett, and she mentioned briefly that she had some different challenges with different Russian authors. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm also curious a little bit about the history of translation. Who are the various translators for Russian literature to English throughout time, like in modern history? Why, like, were they interested in translating Russian literature more because they like the language, the same as Constance Garnett? She just developed this love of the Russian language, and I guess she wanted to share the work with English speakers. And is that like a big reason, or is it more of a political reason, like Zamutin, for example? When they translated "we" into English, it was more for a political activism reason. So I'm curious, which one is the more dominating reason for translating Russian literature into English? Was it more because the translators had a love of the language, or is it more because of the activism aspect of it? And of course, Russian literature started to get me into classical music, which is a new thing because I just felt that it was really overplayed. I think it's because a lot of the Western, like European or British classical music is almost cartoony in a way, like we have like Fantasia and stuff like that. So I just kind of felt it was overplayed and stuff, because like it's in soundtracks, but it's a lot of the actual original sounds is kind of like simplified down for and it's used in soundtracks. That would be a different video, of course, but that's interesting. So Russian literature, the soundtracks, so Russian literature, in Dostoyevsky's The Idiot, there's a painting that was mentioned, and I got into looking at some of the painters, Russian painters throughout time, and their paintings are pretty interesting also. Like they have an emotional depth to them that I really admire. And also when reading about just the Russian lit in general, there's people who are trying to classify or define the Russian soul. And I don't think that's really something you can classify, or you can't put any kind of a soul into a box and define it. I just don't think that exists. It's just not possible, because you can't define a soul. It doesn't matter whose soul it is. You can't define it because it's so fluid and alive and changing and all these kinds of things. So there's some kind of academic people that are they're on a quest for what is the Russian soul. And it's the same thing as the native soul here in Canada. You can't define it. You can't put it into a box. You can observe some of the different qualities of it, like aspects of it and stuff, but you can't define it. It's undefinable. That's why it's so beautiful. When I first got into Russian literature, I really liked the political aspect of it, that it can be a form of activism. You can write, this is what's wrong with society, and this could be a way to fix it or improve it or something like that. And I started to read those kind of books, and I got kind of not overwhelmed, but just beaten into submission. It was just so intense. The two of them that had that huge impact on me were Solzhenitsyn's book and Quiet Flows the Dawn by Sholokhov. And they were so intense that for activism, and I was absolutely done. So I've branched out since then, and I like a lot more than just the activism style of books. Like you also have the Gulag Archipelago, which is what Solzhenitsyn's most famous for. There's actually this is actually 4 parts. This is book 1, book 2, book 3, and book 4. So if you do read it, you could read the abridged version, but I recommend just go for the unabridged because contains more. And he also has the Red Wheel, which they're currently translating right now. And his work is really unique. I still really like him as an author. He is really in close competition for being my favorite, for him or Dostoyevsky. They're both phenomenal writers. And when they talk about Russian literature, they usually only talk about the giants. I guess there's like only 4 or 5 really big books that are actual giants. It would be Brothers Karamazov, Anna Karenina, War and Peace by Tolstoy. So I still have not read those 3 books. They're still sitting on my top shelf. I'm reading all these other books just so I can get ready to read them. Because if Crime and Punishment is that amazing, then how much more amazing would Brothers Karamazov be for Dostoyevsky's work? And I did explore a lot of Solzhenitsyn's work, and I was foolish last year, and I started this one first. It was one of the early Russian works that I read, just because I'm really interested in the dark side of why we do what we do. And back then I was reading Dante's Inferno, and this is from Dante's Divine Comedy, and this one is from Inferno, the title, In the First Circle. And this was another one of the books. When I finally did read it, I couldn't read anything for a while because it's amazing. It's just so good. So the giants, I want to read a lot of the smaller books and work my way up to the giants, because Russian literature, the authors are so well read that they pull in so many different books mostly from Europe and philosophy, and there's so many references, and sometimes they get into references to other works of art or even symphonies and classical music and stuff. So they're pulling in a lot of different artistic and philosophically dense works. So to read some of those works and then to read the fiction that the Russian author wrote about, I think really deepens it. Like, for example, with Dostoyevsky, that's what I did. I read Crime and Punishment before I read Nietzsche's work or anything like that. And I mean, I absolutely loved Crime and Punishment, but then now that I'm starting to read Nietzsche, a lot of their ideas are really compatible with each other, or there's kind of a harmony between the two of them. And I think it just makes reading Dostoyevsky even more rewarding when you get into some of his influencers, people that he would have admired. I think Nietzsche, I don't even know who admired who, but they fit together so well. And Victor Hugo, I'm into French literature now, because French literature is another huge influencer for Russian literature. And Dostoevsky really admired Charles Dickens, so I'm going to try and read a Charles Dickens, maybe Bleak House, maybe revisit David Copperfield, something like that, and just kind of explore. Maybe from Dostoevsky I can get back into British Victorian literature again. But I read Victor Hugo because Hugo is an inspiration for Dostoevsky, and Hugo is amazing. I absolutely love Hugo. The language and description for Hugo is phenomenal, and the psychology, he understands human psychology so well that I can see the influences on Dostoevsky, and that's what makes it so amazing. And then I read this, and then I read The Idiot, and I reread Notes from the Underground, and I'm going to read Devils and Demons this year, so it's going to be interesting because I've already read some books that influenced Dostoevsky, and I'm also reading Les Miserables, so it'll be interesting to finally get to Brothers Karamazov, probably in 3 years or something. I want to beef up my reading history before I get to the actual giants. So The Last Day of a Condemned Man, it's just basically, it's a psychological profile, the psychological thoughts of this man who is on his last day on earth. And it is just, it's a really small book, but it's so intensely packed that when I'm reading it, I can actually I can remember back to Crime and Punishment and Raskolnikov facing his inner turmoil of committing his crime. So it's just amazing. Absolutely amazing to get into who influenced the writers. And of course, Faust by Goethe is also influenced Pushkin. And Pushkin is at the very beginning of the conversation, like I mentioned last year. And a lot of Faustian themes are in literature, the Russian. That you can see all kinds of different allusions to it, and literally the same story is told over and over and over again. Like, for example, Lermontov, A Hero of Our Time, it's very Faustian, but it's the superfluous man. So it's the man who is just overly done and decadent and just like foolish because he's so perfect, but he's actually not perfect, so he actually crosses the line into becoming no longer perfect. And I mean, it's basically the same story, but they're just told from really different points of view, where he is actually a really good guy, he's really smart in Goethe's version, and A Hero of Our Time, he's really foolish. Like, he has these abilities to do these amazing things, and he just doesn't. And it's just silly. So this would be an example of Russian satire. And there's also the magic tales, Russian magic tales or folk tales. I have not read this yet, but I want to get into reading their folk tales and fairy tales. And of course, I want to get into Eastern Europe. I really want to get into Ukrainian folk tales, the Ukrainian literature, and I have a Hungarian one that I'm planning to read next month. And then a book like Dr. Zhivago, the Russian writers, I think they're more famous for being poets than they are for being writers, whereas in the English-speaking world, we're more interested in their literature, not so much their poetry. So Pasternak, he's actually a poet first, and then he's a writer second. So when he wrote this, there's so many parts in this book, even though at the time I didn't know about the history. I didn't know about the revolution or anything leading up to it or the immediate after effects or even the serfdom or anything like that. And just reading it only as a book without knowing any of the history behind it or any of the ideology, because it's written by a poet, that those poetic themes are so tightly woven that it was really intense of a reading experience, and it just made the book so amazing. That's what made this book so amazing. And then of course the Zamyatin, like I mentioned, that's the political aspect of it. And a different side to the political aspect, I think Andrei Bely for Petersburg, which I'm reading right now, and Zamyatin, I think they were friends or they knew each other. They had some kind of real life commonality. But Petersburg, it's written again in a very different style from all of the other books that I mentioned. It is, in some ways, is similar to Ulysses, but with a slightly different take on it. It is very, like, my own thoughts on it. I really enjoy it. I really like it. It has a lot of play on words. But something famous about this book is apparently you have to know the Russian language to be able to really appreciate it. So to read it in translation, more of it is lost than usual when you read something in translation, because so much of it depends on the context of Russian language, that knowing the Russian language is the only way that you can grasp the story. So by me reading it in English and not knowing really anything about the Russian language, I am at a disadvantage. But just even as an English text, without that whole entire aspect of it, there's still a lot of wordplay that still translates into English that makes it really interesting. The way that he layers his sentences and his phrases, he'll put a small phrase and then he'll mention it again in a different paragraph just a few lines away, and it adds that extra layer of complexity to it, which is probably a second or even third plot line. Or of course it could be an allusion to some historical context or something that was happening, or maybe even just the city of Petersburg by itself, or the history of the development of Petersburg. He could be getting into those types of things. And then I think it's very much like the same way that Ulysses is it's about a place can also exist in your mind and in your society's memory as time goes by. That kind of an idea. And Master and Margarita, I wonder if it's a little bit, has some similar aspects to that, but Master and Margarita, I think it's different because it's a lot more into that intertextuality, where it's really pulling in previous works. Like the one scene where Bazarov and Behemoth, I'm pretty sure are the same character, but have a slightly different context. And the reason I think that is it's just one simple thing that happens near the end of Fathers and Son. It's one small scene. I think it's only like one sentence, and that one single sentence is what made me think, oh, that's got to be the cat character from Master and Margarita, because of that one sentence is the same as the description in Master and Margarita. So something so simple can actually link two completely different characters, but the character in Fathers and Sons is like a symbol of nihilism, but it would be European nihilism, which is fighting against the tradition and the long history and the way things are done and the change and this kind of things. So then of course you have the title, which is Fathers and Children. The children would be the little child or teenager or young man who is returning to his father's farm, and he has all these new ideas that he got from school, and then you have that generation gap, or that, you know, that conversation when your children's ideas are different from your parents' ideas, and then how do you reconcile that? And then Master and Margarita is much later, with the revolution and then the actual change of the ideas. So it's just really interesting when you get into actually reading Russian literature and seeing how everything just kind of pieces together, or how you can see all the same story but told from different points of view. It's just amazing. But that gets into this one, where this is actually a conversation, where it's just book 1, 2, and 3, and you have Fathers and Children by Ivan Turgenev, and then you Dostoyevsky, he wrote Notes from the Underground as a really angry retaliation to Fathers and Children. He felt that Fathers and Children is kind of like an idealistic take on what was happening at the time, which is the serfdom, breaking down the system. And then What is to be Done by Cherny Squeaky. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This one. That's how you would say his name. My camera only films for 20 minutes and then it stops. I have to restart it. But if you can see, that's his name. This one was written as political propaganda, and it is, when I first read it, I thought that it was like a book on feminist, because the woman has a very strong role that I didn't see in any of the other works. But now that I've read that House of Government, I can look back at this and I can see, okay, that's where he was coming from with this. And then suddenly this becomes a very creepy book, when it was not a creepy book before. It was a feminist book before. So how can something feminist and good turn creepy and bad? And again, it's context and knowing the history of the time and the ideology and the motives behind everything, and that's what makes it really creepy. And I only read the abridged version, so later this year, I think, or in a couple months, I'm going to finally read this edition, which is by Cornell University. It's the unabridged version. So yeah, it'll be interesting because of that book. I can see the history. So that's basically it. I'll talk about the Russian formalism, symbolism, and some of the literary critics for Russia, for history, in a different video, because that's going to make this video way too long. So leave any comments if you like Russian literature. What do you like about it? Have I sparked any of your interest in reading any of these books? And that's all. Thanks. Bye, book 2.